Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good time tonight, having a good evening. Hi. It's nice and beautiful here in New York City. Beautiful, warm spring night. Hope it's nice where you are also. Okay, I'm going to wait a couple minutes for more people to join us. And hopefully we'll have a nice group tonight. I am happy to announce for those of you who are here already that Mr. James Madison will be joining us on April 30th, as will President George Washington, the Honorable Robert Livingston, and an honor guard as well. So yes, in other words, we will be having an inauguration that day. So lots of good fun ahead of us for Saturday, April 30th. I hope lots of you will join us. Some of you have already bought tickets. That's great. For those of you who haven't, plenty are available. Please don't be afraid to come into the city. It really is not that bad. I've been doing my walking tours and I haven't had any incidents. Also, it's a Saturday and it's Lower Manhattan, which is in much better condition than Midtown. People are back to work in Lower Manhattan. People are out. People live in Lower Manhattan. There's a bit of tourism. So by April, it should be very nice. So if you're in the New York City area, please come out to join us. So far, the tour looks like it will be me, excuse me, Mrs. Q, Congressman James Madison. Of course, my sister, Mrs. Van R, will be visiting from Albany. And at the inauguration, President Washington, the Honorable Robert Livingston, and an honor guard. And I think Mr. Madison is going to have some very interesting things to say on the tour about that morning and the way he escorted the president to the Federal Hall for the inauguration and some other things that are going on. So I think you'll enjoy it very much. And of course, you have the opportunity to interact and speak to all of us during the tour, after the tour, and posing for photos after the tour as well. So I hope you'll come out to join us. If you're not going to be in New York or anywhere near New York, live stream tickets are available as well. And those are all at, let me type the URL for you there at patriottoursnyc.com. For those of you who don't already know, you can get your tickets there. Live stream tickets are available. And for people joining us on the live stream, you'll be able to ask your questions as well. Mr. Q will be behind the camera and he will be relaying all of the questions that come in the chat to us. So hopefully an excellent afternoon, Saturday, April 30th. Hello to everybody. I see lots of people here. It's great to see all of you. Wonderful. Oh, great. This is really nice. I have a little box here I have to close so I can see what's going on. And so please come out and join us April 30th. It's going to be lots of fun. Also, it is Women's History Month. So let me just do my little plug real quickly for my excellent book about Theodosia Burr, available from me. If you like a copy, please get in touch with me. Available from me for $35, including shipping and handling and my signature and personalization if you request it, less than the price now on Amazon. A great book to give to someone for Women's History Month. Really nice book about the lovely Theodosia Burr and New York City in the 1780s and 90s. Oh, we have people from everywhere. Let me put the background back to the non-busy one and see where everyone's from. So we have Philadelphia, Manassas, New Lebanon, New York, Mrs. Mumbus, or Miss Mumbus, my very good friend, who's going to be playing a big role in my life again soon. As I'm going, we're going to be getting a new Q dog soon, and it is Ms. Mumbus who helps us train all of our dogs, and she's very talented at that and a wonderful person as well to know. Who else do we have? Oh, we have people from everywhere. So thank you all for joining me tonight. And as I said, tonight we're going to spend some time talking about our two great founding documents. Oh, and of course we have Florida and Long Island. And talking about our two great founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, and how they fit together. Oh, Ms. Healy is holding up one of them. Declaration, is that the Declaration? So if you do not have a copy, you know what, I'm going to share another link with you just now. Give me a moment. If you do not have a copy of these documents, I'm sharing this on Facebook and YouTube. Let me share it here in the chat here as well. there is an excellent copy. I don't know if that was the whole link that I sent you. I know it was the whole link went out on Facebook. Let me try this again. Just hold on while I find it. There it is for Zoom. If you don't have a copy of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, there is a link to a copy that you can download from the United States Immigration and Naturalization Services. And this is the copy that they give out to people who are studying to take their citizenship test. It has a very nice foreword, little explanation of both documents and the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and all of the amendments as well. So very nice little document. That's PDF format. You can download it. You can download it and take a look at it when we're done. Everyone should read through them. They're really, of course, our foundational documents of our nation. So, of course, we want to understand them. So the Declaration of Independence, you know, is ratified in 1776. And the first thing that it does is talk about what kind of government we should have, or what government is, I should say. And it follows up on a pamphlet that you've heard me speak about before, a pamphlet called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, a bestseller in the year 1776. And Thomas Paine addresses the question of what is government and what is the state of our government today. And Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson, picks up that idea in the Constitution. The best government, he says, is the government for which we pay the least, of course, and get the best in return. And government is really a contract, right, between the people and those we choose to govern us, in which we pay a portion of our wealth in the form of taxes. And in return, we get some services like defense, things like that, regulations on trade, and things that help us to live better, safe, more productive, and profitable lives. And Mr. Paine goes on to talk about the government we had at the time of 1776, which, as you know, was a monarchy. And Mr. Paine says, you know, monarchy is absolutely ridiculous. This is ridiculous. He says a king is expected to make decisions for people everywhere, and the king is the most removed person from reality. What does the king know about the world? What does the king know about anyone's life? He knows nothing, yet he's accepted to make these decisions that affect the lives of millions of people. So he said on the first point, monarchy is ridiculous. He says the king is shut up from the world. And to go further, he says the idea that the king is king by divine right, what you might remember as the divine right of kings, he says is even more ridiculous. You may remember that the symbol of the British crown during the House of Hanover was the lion. And he says, if God meant us to have kings, why does he continuously send us asses as lions? And Mr. Paine shockingly disproves the whole idea of the divine right of kings. And he goes on to say that the parliament is an aristocracy that knows nothing about us, exploits us, and rules over us. And then he asks a very important question. He says, if your life under the rule of a government is full of as much misery as if you had no government, but you're paying for it, then that government really needs to be removed. That is the worst situation you could possibly have. He says to live without government in a state of anarchy is one thing, but to be paying for a government and still be living in a state of anarchy or oppression is even worse than that. And therefore, he says we should all join up here in America as we have a unique opportunity to put all of our past differences behind us, whether we're from England, Scotland, Ireland, Holland, any other place. We can put all of that behind us and form a new nation together based instead on the rule of law, where we are all seen equally under the law. And this is Thomas Paine's premise in Common Sense, a wonderful pamphlet written for regular people, not for the highly intelligent or intellectual, but written for the regular people of America, and something you might want to read along with your Declaration of Independence and Constitution, a very nice document. So Mr. Jefferson goes forward. I see someone has a t-shirt with a copy of the Constitution from the National Archives. That's wonderful. You should wear those, your Constitution, your Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine, someone else to remember. Oh, and I have a good evening from Fredericksburg, from the McHughes. It's good to see you tonight, Mr. and Mrs. McHugh. So the state of our form of government, of course, when the Declaration of Independence was written, was that we were a monarchical tyranny in the form of a king and an aristocratical tyranny in the form of the peers who made up Congress, made up the parliament. So this is the state we're in 17 and 76, a state of rebellion against these things. And I'll get into the specifics of what we were rebelling against in a moment. So if we look at Mr. Jefferson's wonderful writing, when he writes the Declaration of Independence, he has a prelude about why we're writing it, that, that it's time for us to separate from an abusive government. And he reminds us that he says, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Such radical words for that year. And he says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, meaning, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the people, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And you might know all of that from the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. Wonderful words and philosophies from Mr. Jefferson. So we might see the Declaration of Independence here as being a promise of the future, a promise of the type of government that we're fighting for, a government instituted by the people to make their lives better, and only staying in power with the will of the people. So this is the promise. So we might think of the Declaration as the promise, and then the Constitution as the fulfillment of that promise, which of course comes later after the war. So we have this promise from our Declaration of Independence from Mr. Jefferson. And of course, Mr. Jefferson says that, governments shouldn't be overturned for, light and frivolous purposes. They should be serious purposes. And that he says, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, gives us design to reduce them under absolute despotism, or reduces us, he says, under absolute despotism, these abuses. He says it's our right and it's our duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for our future security. And he says such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies. And now is the necessity which constrains us to alter our former systems of government. And he goes on to say, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So he says, we will now set forth our proof that this is what has been done to us as a legal reason to support our declaration for separating from the mother country. Now, before I get to the middle section, let me explain some other things that are going on here that we don't learn in school. One is the royal houses of Europe and Britain, who will not get involved in civil wars within their borders. Of course, they were fighting each other all the time, weren't they? England and Spain, England and Holland, England and France, and various alliances, Austria, all fighting. But their agreement among those royal houses is that if a problem is internal, they will not interfere. So it is very important for us in 17 and 76 to establish that this is not a civil war, but that we are a separate country now, that we are separate. And to support us in war against England is to support a separate country from England. So this becomes an important matter that we have to put forth that year in order to woo the support of England's rivals, don't we? We want the support of England, Holland, and France and Spain. I'm sorry, Holland, France, and Spain, if we can get them, but we can only get them if we are a separate nation from England. So this is part of what this document establishes. And remember, it is written and ratified by many lawyers who have been trained in the common law of England. So the middle section that they lay out then explains step by step the legal reasons. And I'm not going to go through all of them because many of them are quite, since they're legal, are quite long, have a lot of verbiage, and may not be very understandable to you in the future, as they really are rooted in the events of that year. but we do have some that should seem very familiar to you. So for example, he says, the king has dissolved colonial governments and replaced them with military governments. And here specifically, of course, he's speaking about Massachusetts, who after the Boston Tea Party had their colonial charter revoked, which they had had for more than 150 years, and replaced with military government. So the first thing the king has done that he has no right to do is to dissolve colonial governments under the charters they entered into with the monarchs and the parliaments at that time at which the charters were established. And if you're familiar at all with some of the debate that was going on in the parliament at that time, there was one member of parliament who even stood up and said, why should we have to honor these colonial charters that were, established more than 100 years ago? And the great Edmund Burke rose and talked about how absurd that notion was, that if England did not, honor their own colonial charters, even though they were more than 100 years old, what about treaties that England had with other places? And that was a ridiculous notion to think of, that would unravel all of the common law and all of Britain's treaties and promises to other countries. So that was ridiculous, but that was something that was on the table at that time. And clearly they didn't listen to Edmund Burke, as they did withdraw the Massachusetts Charter. Another one you may remember, for quartering troops among us and exempting them from the punishment for murders and crimes committed against us. And some of those crimes, as you know, would be attacks on ladies too. The soldiers often were not punished for their crimes against the people while they were quartered here. And of course, we had many riots and problems about that, the most famous, again, being Massachusetts and the Boston Massacre. And here in New York, we had our own Battle of Golden Hill a few weeks before that. So the dangers of quartering troops. They've cut off our trade with the world. As you know, that England then began to cut off our ports to prevent us from trading with the rest of the world, with other places. Imposing taxes without our consent. Of course, that is the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act and other acts as well. Holding trials in secret and at times outside of America. Then this again is referring specifically to Massachusetts, where after Massachusetts came under military rule as a result of their charter being revoked, the people no longer were granted public trials of fellow citizens in Massachusetts, but sometimes were tried on ships in courts of admiralty. And some people were even taken to England to be tried among people who had no knowledge of them. So they're speaking of this there. And as you know, that will continue throughout the years 17 and 76. It will spread out of Massachusetts. Waging war against us, well, clearly that's the invasion after Lexington and Concord, or the invasion that caused Lexington and Concord and then spread, or at this time, in the summer of 17 and 76, we're talking about the siege of Boston, which has finished, and now the massing of the Army and Navy at the city of New York. So clearly waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. And that is all about that military attack that is commencing in the year 17 and 76, and denied our right to redress of grievances. And that is the most basic fundamental right that was denied to us for years, which ultimately led to the rebellion that caused things like the Tea Act, or the rebellions against the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act earlier, that the Parliament would not hear our pleas about those acts that were being passed against us. So our redress of grievances had been denied for such a long time. So that's the middle of the Declaration, and much, much more. You can read through more of it yourself. Let me check some of the things here. I don't think the European kings had any idea what a president was or what a president could have term limits. Right, we'll get to that when we get to the Constitution about the presidency. That is correct. They did not have any understanding of what we were building here. Yes, and they thought it was absurd Washington didn't become king. We will talk about that as well when we get a little further on into the story. I just want to see if there are any other questions here. Okay, great. So now we get to the final section of the Declaration of Independence, which declares our independence. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of of the world for the rectitude of our intentions do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And of course, the time came with which we would have to defend this document. So a very brave and eloquent document laying out every step. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is our proof that we have the right to do it, and our declaration that we are now a separate nation. So hello, France, Spain, and Holland. So that's what's going on in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, we defended this document over 7 long years of warfare, much to the destruction of us and, loss of our homes, loss of our ports, loss of our money. But at the end of those 7 years, we had attained our freedom. And now it was time to decide what we were going to be. And this, of course, was not an easy task. Now, if I step out of my historical persona for a moment to my modern persona, will tell you that one of the questions I get asked most often on my walking tours is if the war ended in 1781, and well, really for New York, it was 1783. So the British were all gone by 1783. Why was Washington not sworn in until 6 years later? How did that happen? Well, because there are things in between, aren't there? The war ends. We're under the governance of something called the Articles of Confederation, ratified by the Continental Congress during the war. And we think we're going to move forward under those Articles of Confederation. But right away, the people of the colony see that the articles will not be sufficient, that they are indeed deficient in many key areas, including a common defense. The thing that many were most concerned about at the end of the war. Well, now that we had defeated England and were depleted ourselves and now, disunited as separate states, what would keep any of those nations of Europe from coming here and reconquering us? Therefore, we needed a united defense. This was one of the first things that came up. And then some other things, of course, that you might know. Disputes that came up between the states. Now, the states had disputes over trades and tariffs on trades and different laws concerning things. So now we have all of these issues. So we called a convention at Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation. And this is the really fascinating part of the story that we will be really covering on our April 30th tour with Mr. Madison, because most of us, I did not learn this in school, my modern self did not learn this in school, that the original convention at Philadelphia was meant to modify the Articles of Confederation, not to write a new constitution, but to modify. That was the only instructions the gentlemen who attended from the states had. But there were 2 young gentlemen who attended, one from Virginia and one from New York, Mr. Madison and Mr. Hamilton, who independently of each other had come to the realization that a new document was needed. And they both arrived with extensive notes and ideas of what should be in that new document. And their very delegations fought against them. And I should say fought against them. I need to find a stronger word. Battled them, dug their heels in, and thought that these 2 men were far out of order and should not be listened to. But after some convincing, and of course, they had General, now Mr. Washington, on their side, they were able to put forth this idea of a new constitution, that the Articles of Confederation should be removed and a very new document written instead. And so we get the United States Constitution, a really incredible document. I encourage you all to read it and to see how small it is. It is a very short document, brilliantly written and structured, upon which this nation exists. And in the future, that's quite a nation, I hear. Take time to read it. It is fascinating to see how simple it is. And it is indeed a fulfillment of the promise of the Declaration of Independence. And it starts out, of course, we, the people of the United States, in order to achieve some very specific things. And those things are form a more perfect union, right? A more perfect union of these separate states, establish justice, so a system of justice common to us, ensure domestic tranquility, which means keep the states from invading and arguing with each other, right? So we want domestic tranquility where we can all exist together under the same law happily. Provide for the common defense, of course, that thing they were so worried about at that time. Promote the general welfare, that this government should promote welfare throughout the various states, not just in one, but in all, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to posterity. In other words, and blessings of liberty for us today and for you in the future. So very clearly, right in the beginning, it lays out what their intentions are. And they say, we do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. And the Constitution then establishes our three branches of government, a brilliant structure, don't you agree? A legislative branch to make laws, an executive branch to carry out those laws, and a judiciary, courts, to mediate disputes of those laws. And a brilliant structure, isn't it? And even within the legislature, a two-structure government, isn't it? Based somewhat on the old parliament, but not quite. So like the House of Commons, we have a House of Representatives who represents us by number of people. But our upper house is not like the House of Lords in that it is inherited. It also is elected, but it treats each state equally, doesn't it? 2 senators from each state. So a very small state like Rhode Island is equally represented in your time to a very big state like California, or at my time, that might have been Rhode Island and New York, to make sure they have equal representation in some body. So brilliantly, brilliantly thought out, I think, by these gentlemen. An executive branch with a president who is very much like a chief executive officer, you might say, in a corporation. His job is to execute these laws. A president, not a monarch, and a president who is elected. Now, we're going to get to amendments in a little while and some of New York's complaints. And one of those was about a lack of term limit on that executive branch, as New York saw it as being too powerful. Mr. Madison himself thought it was the weakest of the 3 branches. And a judiciary, right, an establishment of a Supreme Court to rule over the differences that occur in the states or among the branches of government. Appointed by the chief executive, the president. So a brilliant idea. And I would like to quote to you from Mr. Madison's Federalist number 51, which is one of my favorites. And we'll be talking a lot about this because I love this. It's called If Men Were Angels, but I'm not going to recite that part. I'm going to recite just a little part where Mr. Madison says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place, oblige it to control itself. As Mr. Madison commented that we know the worst people are drawn to government. There's nothing we can do about this. We know that people drawn to government love power and will want to rule over others. Therefore, we must create a government that controls itself. Their view was that the 3 branches would be adversarial branches. They would all jealously guard their power over each other. And therefore, the executive might get legislature from the Congress that he doesn't like, and he'll veto it. But the legislature, having enough of a majority, could then override that veto. And they would all guard against overreach of each other in this manner, right? So that was the original idea. Whether that would hold up to 250 years of time is something for you to consider. So that is basically the government they gave us, a wonderful government, as the Declaration of Independence said, a government based on the people that can be changed when the people want it to change. Now, I'll step into my modern self again and tell you something you may find shocking. But one of the things I also find on my tours is that most Americans do not know that every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is elected. If you don't like the House of Representatives, if we don't like it, we can get rid of the whole thing every 2 years. Oh, hello, I have someone watching from London. Oh, madam, please, I hope you don't take any of my comments as an insult on your great country, but only as commenting on a temporary problem that existed between us that was remedied over time. Oh, I lost my train of thought. I do this now that I get old. So we were talking about the checks and balances, I think. So the idea is that people now are in charge of their government. Oh, and we can change our government. So every 2 years, the House of Representatives can be completely changed. Is that incredible? What an idea. The whole House of Representatives. If you don't like it, get rid of it. The Senate, every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate. Every 6 years, the whole Senate can be changed. What power we have in our vote. And the presidency, every 4 years, a new president. The entire government can be changed every 6 years to meet our needs and our demands. This is a miraculous thing. No one had seen anything like it before. And indeed, after the American Revolution, when General Washington stepped down and did not make himself a king, everyone was shocked. Who would lead the nation, they said. People can't govern themselves. You need a monarch. You need someone to govern. We also disbanded our military, you might remember, at a time in history where the idea of a nation's strength and greatness was its military. We disbanded our military as well. Because here in America, we were about to do something no one else had done before, truly create a government for the people, of the people, and by the people. And the Constitution does that. A wonderful, wonderful document. So now that it was written, now that these two young gentlemen got their way, and this wonderful Constitution was written, it happened that those two states, Virginia and New York, had many complaints about the Constitution. And these complaints took the form of pamphlets and handbills and articles in newspapers. And those two young men, along with their friend and colleague, Mr. John Jay, picked up their pen to address all of those questions. And those are known as the Federalist Papers, the bulk of them written by Mr. Hamilton, then Mr. Madison, and a handful by Mr. Jay. And they pick up their pen and they address all of these questions. And of course, from New York came the question of the power of the presidency, which New York wanted to see limited to 2 terms in office. And eventually will get in the future in 1951. But Washington, when he stepped down from his second term as president, explained that he agreed the presidency was too powerful and should not be served more than twice by the same man. So Washington acknowledged New York's fear over the presidency, even though the Constitution itself didn't change for a very long time. As Ms. Kaler says, a monarch, a king, and a dictator was the last thing we needed. We needed a temp worker called the president. That's a really interesting and fun way to put it. I never thought of it that way, that he is a temporary executive, isn't he? So now we have a problem. New York and Virginia, even after the Federalist Papers, were still complaining loudly. And Mr. Madison then elicited suggestions for amendments. Something he told me he grew to regret doing is that he had submitted more than 200 amendments. I think he said about 190 from New York alone, as he declared that New York saw this as an opportunity to rewrite the Constitution to their liking. And poor Mr. Madison spent days and nights going through these and ultimately submitted 12 of those to the Constitutional Convention to be ratified, and 10 were ratified. And that is what we call the Bill of Rights. So in the Bill of Rights, we see some very interesting things. The First Amendment, or I should say first, the Bill of Rights does not give us any rights. The Bill of Rights protects our natural rights. These are rights that transcend government. Some might like to call them God-given rights. Others, in the more interested in the Enlightenment, like to call them our natural rights as men and women. Government cannot give these. They transcend government, and government therefore cannot take them. That is what the Bill of Rights establishes, those 10 amendments. And when we look at number one, we see right away that New York came from various troubles arising out of the colony of New York. So the first part of the Bill of Rights, of the First Amendment, I'm not sure if I have it in order here, the right of assembly. The right of assembly comes from a court case in the early 1700s in New York, when two Presbyterian pastors, remember we were under governance of the crown, the official religion was the Church of England, and you could not compete with the Church of England publicly. Two pastors were preaching in someone's home with the doors and windows open. And this was said to be a violation of preaching only indoors and that they could be heard outside. And they were arrested, imprisoned, and tried. And the brilliant lawyers in New York who defended them had them found not guilty by the jury. And this established the right of association in New York. And pastors then began to preach on the street to bring people into their churches. So from New York. Another one from New York, from the First Amendment, the free press, from the trial of our own John Peter Zenger, who was arrested for his newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal, which was exposing corruption in the royal governor's government, Governor Cosby's corrupt government. And for that, the printer was charged with seditious libel and jailed. He was in jail for 9 months, as trials were not held daily as yours are. Sometimes there would be some time between parts of the trial. And he spent 9 months in jail. During that time, his great spouse, Mrs. Anna Zenger, made sure the newspaper still was put out, because the point of jailing Mr. Zenger was trying to stop his paper from being printed. So she saw to it that it was. And at the end of his trial, the jury nullified the libel law in New York, rewriting it to say that a libel was only a libel if it was purposefully a lie. In other words, if it was true and you didn't like it, it's not a libel. And if it was false, but the printer did not know it at the time of printing, it also is not a libel. So you can maybe know where that went with the newspaper printers, but that established the free press in New York, which of course we wanted, guaranteed in our new Constitution, and the right for the government to not be able to impose a religion upon any of us. Remember, many of us came to this land fleeing religious oppression in Europe. Anabaptists, Moravians, Jews, Huguenots, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Quakers, all sorts of people trying to escape Catholicism and the Church of England. And so it was imperative that there never be a government-established religion that anyone had to pay taxes to or worship. This also comes partly in the dispute over King's College, which in your time is Columbia College of Columbia University, which when it was built by the Church of England, all taxpayers were subject to tax to support this school. And a group of lawyers opposed this tax. It was eventually removed. As they said, only 17% of the colony was Anglican, and why should all the rest pay a tax to the Anglican Church? So you can see these things being argued in the colonies long before the Revolutionary War, Declaration of Independence, and Constitution, but a desire that they be enshrined and guaranteed to us in this Constitution. Now, remember, we talked about that middle part of the Declaration of Independence. Well, some of those amendments in the Bill of Rights are directly related to that middle section of the Declaration of Independence. For instance, the Third Amendment says that we shall never be required to quarter troops in our home or quarter troops in our towns, except under, great and exceptional circumstances of war. So that from the Quartering Act and us being forced to quarter troops. The Fourth Amendment guarantees all searches must have a warrant, a signed warrant by a judge, because of course, as you know, during the time where we were having problems with the mother country, searches were issued without warrants, or the same writ would be used over and over again. A governor would sign off on one writ and it would just be used repeatedly against multiple people. We wanted to make sure that did not happen. The Fifth Amendment, that you have the right to be indicted by a grand jury, that you can't be tried twice for the same crime, that you cannot be a witness against yourself, and that there can be no deprivation of life, limb, or property without due process. As we know, all of these things were happening under military rule in Massachusetts and under occupation of the colonies during the war. Now, I think this last one is a bit interesting, that no deprivation of life, limb, or property without due process. And here I'm speaking in the future to my libertarian friends who might be very concerned about something you have in the future called civil forfeiture, in which a person who has been accused of a crime but not tried or convicted has their property confiscated by the local police departments. I don't know. That seems rather suspicious to me. I think you should think about that in your time. I'm not going to spend much time on that though, but that was just a little tipping my hedgehog to the libertarians of the future. So with the Bill of Rights, of course, New York agreed to ratify, and now we had enough states to ratify. I think we had enough states before New York, but what would the nation be without New York? New York stuck right there in the middle, not ratifying. Would the country go around New York? It's ridiculous. So New York had to ratify. And with the inclusion of the Bill of Rights, New York agreed to ratify the Constitution. And under the Constitution, our elections for the House were held. Our senators were appointed by our local governments, our state governments, and our House of Representatives unanimously voted for former General Washington to become our first president, President George Washington. And he was sworn in here in the city of New York, April 30th, 1789, the only inauguration ever to be held in the city of New York. So I hope you'll come out and join us as we commemorate it this year with a really fun afternoon. Just a chance to walk through the city with a whole bunch of costumed performers. I'm not going to tell you exactly who will be on the tour, but I promise you people will be showing up as we walk along to entertain you and to speak to you. Just a wonderful way to spend an afternoon learning about the nation's history. And of course, you can attend on live stream as well. So if you have any questions or comments about either document or the Bill of Rights or the things that were going on, please let me know. As you know, I am the first person to admit to the difficulties New York has always had in ratifying things, right? Not signing on to the stamp convention, the resolves of the Stamp Act Congress, or not wanting to vote on the Declaration of Independence, and now being problematic with the Constitution. But New York always comes through. And I do think in the case of the United States Constitution, that the anti-federalists, as they were called here, had many good points and secured many good things for us in their refusal to go forward without these assurances. So I think New York did, give us some good things along the way. Of course, prosperity and money from New York. Let me see. The Pilgrims called themselves separatists for that reason. They wanted to separate themselves from the Anglican Church. Exactly. There were many people here. New York had over 14 different religious denominations, outlawing only one, and that would be Catholicism, or popery, as they called it. But I'll share with you that if the Presbyterians and their allies could have outlawed the Church of England in New York, they would have done so as well, as they saw it as just as bad. The view of them was that the Church of England and the Catholic Church, in your time, you might call them more like cult-like environments, and did not encourage free thought. And there was also some other things being Protestants they did not agree with. For instance, most people in the colonies at that time were followers of Jonathan Edwards, and the idea that all people are created the same in the eyes of God, and therefore should be treated the same way in the eyes of the law. And as you know, that would take us a very long time to enshrine in America. But the idea was based at that time in New England with the Congregationalists and the Protestants and Jonathan Edwards. We are all the same in the eyes of the Lord, and therefore must all be the same in the eyes of the law, the foundation of our national laws. Okay, let's see. Ms. Kaylor, you can buy a live stream ticket and join us that way. You can chat just like this, and I will get your chat comments, as will Mr. Madison and Mrs. Van Aar, and then President Washington will be available to speak with after the tour. So we'll have a really great time. And if you do buy tickets, in-person tickets, and you are interested in having lunch on historic Stone Street with the history interpreters on the tour, please let me know in the comments if that interests you. And maybe we'll plan to go down to Stone Street in full costume and enjoy a meal together if you would like that. Thank you so much. It looks like all of you enjoyed this. They didn't encourage free thought. It depended on where you were in America, whether or not free thought was encouraged. It's, I think, difficult in the future for you to remember how different each one of those colonies were from each other, and why it took until after the Civil War for people to develop a national identity. After the Revolutionary War, each of our states viewed each other almost as a separate nation. A state being a state like the states of Europe, all independent with their own cultures, their own ideas, their own local laws, that would be united in this concept of federalism, where the state government would be supreme and the federal government would bring them together in a way that was conducive to everyone's prosperity, safety, and liberty. So it's a little bit different concept in my time than I think the way you see it in your time. The colonies and later the early states were very different from each other in many, many ways. And so where you might, in the salons of New York, as we see in the 1790s, we see young ladies like Theodosia Burr, who are educated and very outspoken and interacting with the educated gentlemen of their time on an equal basis on subjects like geography and literature and philosophy and things like that. In New York, certainly you're not seeing, as Miss Burr learned when she became Mrs. Alston and went to South Carolina, you're certainly not seeing that in South Carolina. So you're seeing very different things happening during this time in those original states, very different places. So try to keep that in mind a little bit in your time when you look back on my time, that we did not have a national identity in my time as you have in your time. That is going to be many, many years away from Mrs. Q, I think maybe 100 years after my death. So take a very long time to develop that identity. And maybe one night I'll talk about that and some of the, well, I would have to be a lady in a different era, wouldn't I? I would have to be 100 years later. I would, I think, have to be dressed up as the 1880s and talk about the Civil War and the different ideas about President Lincoln. So you'll have to wait for that because I don't have any 1880s clothes. So you'll have to wait for that to come. So thank you for joining me. Keep following me on social media. I've begun working on my outfit for April 30th. And I must show you, I found this lovely ribbon, which I think you'll be seeing as some trim or perhaps a nice bow on the front of my dress that day. I'll have to consult with Mrs. Van Aar to see how she thinks this ribbon ought to be used, but I think you'll be seeing this ribbon. And I hope to see lots of you that day. We'll have a wonderful time. Please join us on the live stream if you can. Kyle and I, Kyle Jenks, Mr. Madison and I are hard at work putting together something really wonderful for you. Yes, I think in your time, Ms. Kaylor, in 2022, you are united as a single country. Mr. White, thank you so much for your compliment. And thank you, all of you. If you have any topics you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. Get your copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and read them. It is so important. Thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And I will see you all next Friday night with another great topic. Thank you so much.